LatinDad, Arab Watch Coalition, Boston University Global Development Policy Center, it's always a mouthful, Eurodad, Afrodad, which are, of course, acronyms, but I think many of you are familiar with their entire names. I will spell them out later. Bretton Woods Project and Oxfam International. Thank you very much. And I'm Alex Main, Director of International Policy at the Center for Economic and Policy Research, and I'll be moderating this panel about special drawing rights, their uses and impact in developing countries. And I suspect that most, if not all of the people in this room are quite familiar with SDRs, so I'll be brief in describing them. They are international reserve assets that are issued by the IMF when the Board of Governors agrees to do so with a vote of at least 85%. Their value is based on a basket of major internationally traded currencies, and they're allocated to countries according to the size of countries' IMF quota shares. The first purpose of SDRs is to supplement countries' foreign reserves, but they can do much more than that. They can be exchanged for internationally traded currencies. They can be used to pay off debt. They can be used for domestic budget support. They have done and will hopefully continue to do a whole lot of good in the world, especially the developing world. And that's why we're here to talk about them today. A 2011 IMF report on SDRs stated that it can be argued that SDRs are inherently superior to endogenously generated reserves. They are costless as long as they're held in reserves. They're continuously available. They're continuously liquid. They can be accumulated without contributing to global imbalances. They can be considered to be a better store of value than major international currencies taken separately. To these benefits, I would add that SDRs are allocated without conditionalities. Countries can use these resources as they see fit, and they don't have to sign up for austerity programs. SDRs are debt-free while they sit in countries' foreign reserves, and if they are exchanged, interest payments have tended to be minimal. By providing instant liquidity, SDRs help countries that are facing urgent balance of payments difficulties. They can help stabilize the finances of countries whose economies are impacted by external shocks like a pandemic or like the current polycrisis of supply chain difficulties, inflation, soaring interest rates, and sovereign debt distress that we're seeing in many developing countries today. Finally, as climate advocates have noted, they can help developing countries address the challenges posed by climate change. SDRs, as you all know, have gotten very popular in recent years. In 2009, the IMF board approved a major allocation of nearly $250 million worth of SDRs to provide liquidity to countries struggling to recover from the global financial crisis. When the pandemic hit, there were new calls for a new allocation. Initially, the US Treasury, which, thanks to the US's voting share at the IMF, can veto SDR allocations, stood in the way of a new issuance. However, US congressional leaders lobbied for an allocation, and legislation in the US Congress supporting a major allocation of SDRs was passed in the US House of Representatives. When a new US administration came in 2021, the US Treasury ended up joining the rest of the world in supporting an allocation of a record $650 billion in August of 2021. That allocation was highly successful by any measure. Dozens of countries used them to pay for essential imports, to pay off debt, and to buttress their finances. Our panelists will talk more about how these SDRs were used, and you can find reports and articles on how these SDRs have been used on my organization's webpage at Center for Economic and Policy Research.net, CEPR.net. Since that last allocation, the global economic context has remained dire for many developing countries. And along with appeals for rechanneling SDRs from wealthy countries to poorer countries, there have been renewed calls for a fresh allocation from around the world and in the US. Here in Washington, US legislators have again called on the US administration to support a new allocation of SDRs. Last week, the same appeal was made by over 50 US organizations, including the country's biggest trade union confederation, the AFL-CIO, and groups like Oxfam America, ActionAid USA, the Center for American Progress, and the International Crisis Group. And just yesterday, the global advocacy org Avaz, I'm sure we've all received petitions from Avaz, have put out a policy brief calling for a $650 billion issuance of SDRs and the reallocation of existing SDRs. So the clamor for more SDRs is growing in this country and around the world. But I'll stop there as we have a distinguished panel of experts here today to talk about SDRs, how they've been used, the impact they've had, and their potential usefulness in the future. We were to have 6 distinguished experts today. Unfortunately, Avinash Persaud at the last minute was pulled into an urgent meeting, no doubt to discuss the Bridgetown initiative. He's not able to join us. He will be here in spirit. And so we have 5 experts today. And in order to have time for the presentations and to have a good Q&A, I'll ask that they keep their remarks within 8 or 9 minutes. We will have Jason Braganza, the Executive Director of the African Forum on Network on Debt and Development. So that stands for AFRODAD. Richard Kozel-Wright, Director of the Globalization and Development Strategies Division at UNCTAD. Laura Merling, Senior Policy Advisor at the Boston University Global Development Policy Center and a CEPR Senior Research Fellow. Patricia Miranda, Global Advocacy Director at the Latin American Network for Economic and Social Justice, LatinDad. And Andrea Gamba, Deputy Division Chief in SPR International at the International Monetary Fund. Thank you very much, Andrea, for joining us today. We're going to start off with Lara Merling. She co-authored a report published by my organization, CEPR, looking at how dozens of developing countries used SDRs received under the 2021 general allocation. And she recently co-authored with Kevin Gallagher a piece entitled "To Avert a Global Debt Crisis, IMF's Reserve Assets Need Greater Support," a piece in which the authors call on US policymakers to strongly support a new issuance of SDRs. Lara, take it away. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. Can we see the slides? Yes, and okay. So the first question I was going to answer already has been answered by Alex a little bit on what are SDRs. But what I want to emphasize is that they're a reserve asset and they represent a potential claim on one of the 5 currencies in the IMF's basket. And that's very important because it means that if, let's say, rich countries have SDRs on their balance sheets, there's no resources being wasted. It's just something that's on a balance sheet somewhere. So that should not be an argument against a new issuance. And the 5 hard currencies are the US dollar, euro, British pound, Japanese yen, and renminbi. And countries can exchange their SDRs that are allocated to them for a hard currency through the IMF if they demonstrate a balance of payment need. The other important feature is that SDRs cannot be held by anyone. They can only be held by central banks and official organizations that are recognized as prescribed holders. How can countries use SDRs? And we, in the report that Alex mentioned, the 2021 paper, identified these 5 different uses, and some of them require doing nothing, even by getting an allocation of SDRs. It means that countries are getting these reserve assets on their balance sheet, so it strengthens their position. They can use it for fiscal purposes, and we identified many countries that did that during the pandemic. They can use it for new spending, and they can also be used to repay debt to the IMF. And then the only use that has some cost attached to it is if you exchange it for a hard currency, you have to pay the SDR interest rate on the SDRs you've used, but there's no maturity or no need to immediately repay the SDRs. And the SDR rate used to be very low because it matches the interest on those 5 currencies, and it's now only higher because of the actions in advanced economies. And as Alex also mentioned, decision to allocate the SDRs needs 85% support. At the IMF, the US alone has 16% of the votes, which means without the US on board, there cannot be a new allocation. And the US could support allocations under roughly 650 billion, which is what happened in 2021, without congressional support if US Treasury decides to do that. And once SDR allocations are decided and voted on, they are distributed based on the quota shares that countries have at the IMF, which is why we will see the uneven distribution. And this is just a reminder if anyone needs a refresher on how much bigger the US voting power at the IMF is than everyone else's. So if we look at the 2021 allocation, in this graph, we can see by specific aggregates that we looked how much of the allocation went where. And we see that for emerging and developing economies, if we exclude China, we have about 210 billion from the allocation that went there, and a lot of it did go to advanced economies. However, even though it was a very uneven distribution, and we might think that the fact that 440 billions went to countries that didn't need them might be a waste. If we compare this allocation to other forms of relief and support that countries received during the pandemic, it's much larger, but it's still nothing compared to what this graph shows is the percentage of GDP advanced economies spend on the pandemic report. That's the yellow line. So that's what it would have looked like if EMDs would have been able to spend the same amount. Then next we have the SDR allocation for low and middle income countries, then the countries that were eligible for the SSI, and also how much they got suspended through that, which was also not relief, just a suspension. And then the last one is the catastrophe containment and relief trust countries that got some debt to the IMF forgiven through this trust. And we can see how much that was and still less than the SDR allocation. This is now from a map from the update that just Kevin Cashman and Andres Arauz did without me, but it's the most up-to-date data that by July 2022, 105 countries had used their SDRs. And what we can see is that actually the use is based on need, and we see that it is mostly developing countries, and actually there's only one country that's an advanced economy that used SDRs, and that's Greece for a repayment to the IMF, a small amount of their allocation. And this is by July 2022, by income groups, how much of the allocation was exchanged by the different countries. You can also find these on the website and in the report, so no need to go through them. But this is by regions, and what we can see that Sub-Saharan Africa, even though they didn't get a large amount of the allocation, what they did get was spent. So by July 2022, the take-up rate of using those SDR was over 90% for Sub-Saharan Africa. And then for the advanced economies, it's actually just the case of Greece and how much of their allocation they used for this one IMF repayment. And what we see now, and I'm sure my colleagues will talk more about this, and in the context of the specific regions, that things are worse now than they were in 2021 in some ways, and the interest rate hikes that we see in advanced economies are causing a lot of trouble for developing countries. There's really large capital outflows because when interest rates go up here, the money that was flowing into all of these emerging and developing countries during the time of low interest rates is starting to flow out, and it's causing financial instability. It's causing exchange rates there to depreciate, and it's increasing the cost of borrowing and servicing debt. And for this is a graph from a UN DESA report recently, where they tried to estimate a little bit just the increase in debt servicing costs from depreciation of currencies, also showing how, as a percentage of revenue, debt servicing has increased a lot in 2022 compared to 2019. And on the topic of this panel is countries, as we see the situation, countries do have very large investment needs, and sort of lowball estimates are 1 trillion annually for EMDs without China by 2025, and over 3 trillion by 2030 to make all the needed investments in climate and development goals. And that's where, when we get these amounts, we hear a lot of proposals on how can they attract the private capital or private savings to get those investments. And there's, a lot of questions there on what that would mean for development and development goals, especially if you try to get foreign investment for all the bankable and profitable project. It means that all your profits will also leave the country. So in some ways, it's not like more SDRs or a new allocation will solve all these issues or magically fix development, but it could provide a boost of reserves and hard currency for countries to pay some imports that they would need to undergo such a structural transformation. And the other thing I think that's very important to talk about is all the conversations about rechanneling versus a new allocation, which is we hear a lot that, okay, we have these hundreds of billions of SDRs sitting there unused. So why do we need a new allocation? And that goes back to the starting point of they're sitting there unused, but they're not really wasting anything if they're just sitting there. And most of the proposals we've seen in practice about rechanneling are through instruments that create debt. And high debt is already a very big problem, and a lot of countries are in debt distress. So that's not exactly what countries need. A lot of the mechanisms too have conditionality attached, and the example is the Resilience and Sustainability Facility set up by the IMF, which there's a lot of demand for apparently, but to go to that facility, you have to have an IMF program. IMF programs come with conditionality. A lot of that conditionality is often include based on fiscal consolidation measures or austerity measures and other proposals that are kind of not compatible with this big investment push that countries would need to undertake for development and climate goals. And the other thing that I want to also mention in terms of the amounts needed and also kind of what the RSF can offer is the norm there for borrowing is 75% of quota. A new allocation would give countries, if we go for 650 billion, it means that countries would get about 95% of their quota debt-free one time all at once versus an RST loan that gives you 75% of your quota for 20 years with a lot of conditions. So just kind of to repeat that, it means a new allocation of 650, 210 billion worth of reserves would immediately be received by all the other emerging and developing countries. So the key takeaways would be that supporting a new allocation is something that is cost-free. There's no cost to anyone for issuing them, and it would give countries a boost. And even if there's this uneven distribution, that's because the governance structure and quota structure of the IMF is uneven. So that should not be used against developing countries and as an argument to prevent getting them more support. And it's still the most they've gotten, even in this type of distribution. And the fact that rechanneling is very, very different than the new allocation, and those mechanisms are not the same things. And even there, there's a pledge from the G20 to rechannel 100 billion worth of SDRs from what they got. And if it's going to go anything like the COP 100 billion pledge, we might be waiting for a long time to even see that happen. And then, as I said, it's not as if the SDR allocation would fix everything, and it still needs to be complemented by other measures and debt relief and a debt restructuring mechanism, or reform of the entire international financial architecture and the trade system. That's it.
So thanks very much, Lara, and also for keeping within the time. Next, we have Andrea Gamba, from the International Monetary Fund. We're very appreciative of your presence, and Dran, look forward to your remarks on SDRs.
Thank you very much for having me here. And I would briefly, don't have a presentation, unfortunately, but I think that from the slides that we just saw and your introduction, much of what I wanted to say at the beginning has already been covered. And so some backgrounds on the SDRs, what they are. They are claims on reserves, they're not exactly a currency. But let me then jump through the allocation and the discussion of what basically led to the decision to the 2021 allocation, and then the consequent rechallenging of SDR, which is in a way what we will probably keep discussing in terms of the use of SDRs, which have been already allocated in the next few months and years, perhaps. So the decision to have a new allocation in 2021 was something which took a while. And of course, the pandemic crisis was the major driver. But something that came with it was really the acknowledgement that SDR allocation are in line with quota shares in the fund. So richer countries get more SDRs because they have a bigger quota. And so together with allocation was a decision to work immediately to start rechanneling SDRs from countries who didn't need them to those countries who need them the most. And I think this is a useful background because in a way, the allocation in 2021 served two purposes. One, immediate, was to provide liquidity at the global level to face the immediate BOP needs, the balance of payment needs that the pandemic crisis had created. And it was an immediate, very strong effect because it not only provided liquidity, but it really boosted confidence, especially in those countries who were in the weakest position. So we see this as a very positive effect. And the second effect is really this ongoing debate about rechanneling SDRs, which in a way multiplies their effect because it takes SDR can be voluntarily channeled by economies, strong economies that do not need them to poor countries from a variety of instruments. And I'll get there in a second. Let me now step back a little bit back on the allocation itself and how the SDRs have been, the SDR allocation been useful or not in 2021. We saw some of these results already in the previous slides, and we think it's been very impactful in a positive way, especially for low-income countries. So this was the $650 billion equivalent, was the largest allocation in history. And it of course went to all countries who are IMF members, so on about 190 countries. And we saw in the following month that we have seen different usages of the SDR. So in emerging market and developing economies, about 30% of countries did use the SDR. So they didn't keep them in reserves. They used them either to finance their balance of payment needs or for fiscal purposes to increase spending, which was urgent. The advanced economies mostly didn't need the SDRs to be used for their needs, but many of them decided to rechannel them. And so about 20% of them already pledged to channel these SDRs to one of the three tools that we have envisaged. And one thing I want to say, because it's also recent, is that you probably have heard, and there was a reference to it, a G20 commitment to channel about 100 billion SDRs to low-income economies. I think we are closer there than maybe, I would say, I would not draw comparison with the climate finance pledge, but I think that we are getting closer, and you see it in these days that the tension is still there. So in 2021, at the Rome Declaration, there was a commitment by many countries to channel at least 20% of their SDR allocation to more vulnerable countries. Some of these pledges have been already stepped up. So France came out pledging 30% and urging other countries to do so. And Japan, I think yesterday or the day before yesterday, pledged 40%. So we see that the discussion and the positive momentum continues from allocation, and there is lots of awareness from those countries that can that channeling SDRs to poorer countries has a strong effect. Now, let me get to how are SDR channeled. And there are three main ways that the IMF have been working on following shareholders' decision. So the countries have decided to focus on three items. One is, in a way, a long-standing tool to support low-income economies, which is the Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust. That provides short and medium-term balance of payment support for countries with a lower income, and they support a broad range of structural reforms. And I would say we're not really talking only about austerity measures. We're talking really about things that can spur growth. That's really in the title of a trust for a reason. It's a set of facilities which taps on this trust, which is specifically to help countries achieve their longer-term development needs. And you cannot do that. No country can do that without macroeconomic stability. So the PRGT supported facilities try to really achieve that difficult balance of keeping the macroeconomic stability on the one hand, but also giving the space for countries to invest and spend in the critical development needs that they have. And we have seen actually that since the pandemic, these development needs have all increased, and there are many challenges that are facing low-income countries. About 60% of them are either in debt distress or at high risk of debt distress. And there are many estimates, but all of them concur that the pandemic has basically meant that the SDG target has taken a hit, and that to achieve them now on time, much more money is needed in the hundreds of billions, sometimes in the trillions, if you include like all development needs and climate needs. So the PRGT tries to do what is right at the policy level to ensure that as much money as possible, not only from the fund, can flow into this country, while supporting good reforms. And in order to do that, there was a decision to considerably step up the trust, which means more loan resources, but also more subsidy resources, because the PRGTs already currently carries zero interest rate. But in order to do that, there needs to be a kind of subsidy that helps us pay off these loans. And so what we are working on with our contributors is to try and fill this gap, both on the loan side and on the subsidy side, so that we can continue stepping up the support for low-income countries. And the second point of the second channel, let's call it, through which SDRs can be actually transferred to more vulnerable countries is new, and it is the Resilience and Sustainability Trust. And we already know from the previous presentation, but I would say that this is kind of a very new thing for the fund. The managing director has called it revolutionary for us, because it's the first time that we're really venturing to long-term financing. And this became, again, precisely out of the pandemic. We realized, our shareholders realized, that we needed a tool to address long-term challenges that will really imperil macroeconomic stability, maybe not today, but in 10, 20 years' time. And these have been identified as climate change and pandemics. We try to learn from, unfortunately, the pandemic crisis, but we're also acutely aware that climate change is an existential risk to all of us, and especially to countries who are most vulnerable. So we have basically designed the trust with this long-term nature in mind, which is, again, a first for the fund. So we are talking about very long-term loans, which are very concessional, 20-year maturity, 10.5-year grace period, a tiered interest rate structure, so that countries which are eligible for the RST, which is basically 2/3 of our membership, but those in this eligible list that are better off basically pay a little more to cross-subsidize the countries which are more vulnerable and poorer. And that creates basically a financing mechanism which is very affordable to all groups of countries. And we find it, from the high demand, we find that countries do find it attractive. There was a mention, what does this money come attached to? And yes, we do support reforms, but I would say that this is a completely different kind of reforms or conditionality than our traditional, what we call UCT programs. So our traditional programs to support actual balance of payment needs. The RST really is geared to the long term. So we are supporting long-term reforms, which the country want to do. And sometimes we do not have the capacity to do, or do not have the money to finance in the short term because the returns are in the long term. And the RST tries to fill that gap. And so we have initiated in a way, a fundraising drive, which has been successful so far. We are about 2/3 of the way in terms of getting our targeted resources. And we hope to get more from countries that have a strong external position. Let me quickly close on another channel for which SDRs could be transferred to a low-income country, which was something that was not the immediate priority because it requires a bit more time, but that we have been working on and supporting NDBs think about, which is precisely to transfer SDRs to NDBs, so that they could step up their operations and the lending cost. And this is something that in a way is more designed at the NDB level, but we have given support to those financial organizations that have approached us to get some advice on how to structure this. And we have a proposal from the African Development Bank that basically meets some criteria to preserve the reserve asset status of the SDR by mimicking a little bit what the rather complicated structure that we have in the fund, which is based on encashment, so that the SDR which are put into this pool of resources can be called back if there is any urgent need, and the other contributors would support that need by putting cash in. But in terms of the use of these tools, this is something that the MDBs are working on, and we are in a way not really. But overall, we think that the allocation itself has been very impactful on its own merit, but that it has the added merit that this channeling discussion and the debate on how make the best use of SDRs and how much of them to channel, what are the right tools and what are the kind of financial conditions that should come with it has been very positive. And so we welcome the ongoing debate and also today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrea. And for those who are standing, there is an overflow room. If you'd like to sit down, it's just next door with a video, I think a big video screen where you can watch everything. Should you get tired of being, standing up. So next we have, we're very honored to have Jason Braganza from Afrodad, who has, over the last few years, advocated for a fairer distribution of SDRs and for scrutinizing the rechanneling of SDRs to ensure that it doesn't involve conditionalities that harm the poorest, that increase inequality or undermine gender equality. Afrodad, of course, focuses on the issues of debt, in particular in Africa. I think it's worth noting that last year, the finance ministers of Africa joined together to ask for a new allocation of special drawing rights to provide the region with much needed liquidity. So, Jason, looking forward to your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alex, and thank you all for making time. It's been a very busy week, I'm sure, but I think I'll start off my contributions really by not repeating what Lara mentioned in her presentation in terms of what special drawing rights are. But just to emphasize a couple of points with regard to the experience on the African continent. I think the first point of emphasis is to remember that the SDRs in principle continue to remain a short-term liquidity injection to deal with immediate crises or to help African countries deal with immediate crises that they are facing. And I think the global pandemic was a very good example of how special drawing rights in that sense can be a very useful instrument and a very useful tool. We did see that although albeit very little amount that came to the continent, in terms of the impact of stabilizing many countries, in terms of their currency reserves and central bank reserves, as well as creating that additional liquidity injection to support social protection programs that were protecting African lives at the time as being very important. But I think within that, the other impact area that we should be paying a bit more closer attention to is the fact that it is a short-term liquidity form of injection into the economy. And what it tends to do in the continent is to keep us in a constant mode of short-term planning and short-term reaction to what the continent is facing. And I think there is an issue there that needs to, for us, on this panel, and perhaps even as we continue talking about special drawing rights, to think about this idea that we are constantly dealing with short-term issues and not creating the space for us to deal with medium to long-term aspects. And in terms of policy making, but also in terms of what special drawing rights in their initial form has been defined, they're not meant to be debt inducing. They're not meant to be, conditioned to any sort of policy conditionality or otherwise. So, and because they are short term, they don't create the space or don't enable any sort of policy space or financing space to think about medium to long term intervention. So, I think, in terms of the benefits in the immediate term, yes, there are some of those that are happening. And I think many countries, from the work that AfroDad has done in tracking SDRs on the continent, there were some of those immediate short-term benefits that did accrue. Another impact, of course, was the stability that special drawing rights provides in terms of currency reserves and central bank reserves. I think, the point about giving confidence, I just thought you'd have just said gives confidence to the market, because essentially that's what it did in terms of this special drawing rights. But, again, the reason I'm making that point is because a lot of the ideas around special drawing rights and the stability it's supposed to create is more about allowing the market to get better, to feel confident that, the continent was stable, and that African governments could still then go back to capital markets and try and get resources and loans. And I think that is something that we need to think about when we're talking about long term and what that actually means. In terms of the more broader aspects, some of the conversations around the proposals of a new allocation, the rechanneling. One of the concerns we're having is that if there is going to be some form of rechanneling, is that in the initial sense, there is no debt that's being created. But then if it goes through an intermediary institution, so for example, the African Development Bank, you then have a problem, because the bank will then try to leverage the special drawing rights. At least that's my understanding of the proposal, which means it is a lending institution on the continent, which means it then becomes debt-inducing sort of further down the line. And I think that then becomes slightly problematic in terms of dealing with deeper systemic structural issues. So whilst the special drawing rights on the continent has the potential to do that short-term liquidity injection and provide that stability, I think in the medium to long term, unless there are deeper systemic structural changes in how the global economy works, some of the proposals that are being put on the table are actually going to be debt-inducing, even though the language being used, or the political language being used for rechanneling proposal, is that it's not debt-inducing. And I think some of those nuances and those caveats are things that we as AFRODAD on the continent are encouraging some of our policymakers to pay slightly closer attention to. But let's also sort of take a bit more of an abstract view of what special drawing rights are in terms of political economy analysis and what it means then also for the African continent. I think because of the way the special drawing rights are allocated, it does continue to exacerbate and demonstrate the power inequalities and the power asymmetries that exist within the IFI's institutions. So again, the infographic that Lara showed, Africa as a continent that received the least cumulatively of special drawing rights, but the need was the greatest. There are countries that didn't have any shade of blue, which means the allocation that they received from the 650 billion are probably going back into their own reserves and shoring up their own sort of central bank, whereas the countries that needed it the most on the continent is still now having to think about instruments like the PRGT, like the RST, which are heavy on policy conditions, if I'm not mistaken, which then further crowds out policy space or shrinks policy space on the African continent. So in terms of that experience, this is something that we need to again pay a little bit more closer attention. I think finally, just thinking through what that should then mean moving forward is there an opportunity to take advantage of the quarter review process that's about to start? Perhaps there might be some positive things that come out of there in terms of then how allocations are used in the future. But I think that's something that we can think about. But certainly the experience in the medium to short term, yes, positive. But I think in terms of being transformational, in terms of getting the African continent from being a primary commodity dependent continent to being a middle high income transformed developed economy, I think there's some problems there, because also the fact that the special drawing rights conversation still continues to be a lot more about market driven, leveraging private finance, debt instruments or debt financing development does tend to be problematic. I think what we should be talking about is how can the idea of special drawing rights be used to think about more systemic reforms in terms of transformative economic policy, creating more fiscal policy space in countries that need it the most in terms of dealing with their challenges. So I think that has been broadly our understanding, our analysis on the continent of what special drawing rights had done during the issuance in 2021, and how then the conversation should be sort of dealt with as we go forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jason. And to all our panelists, when we finish with the presentations, you will have an opportunity first to respond to the presentations of the other panelists, if you like to, before we dive into the Q&A. And for the folks that are still standing, just a reminder that there is an overflow room. Aldo has strong legs. He'll be fine. And I'm sure all of you do. But if you should want to go to the overflow room, it's just next door. And you'll be able to follow all of this from over there. And next we have Latin America. Patricia Miranda from LatinDad. And LatinDad was an early proponent of an SDR allocation at the beginning of the pandemic. In 2020, Patricia co-authored with Andres Arauz a paper entitled Latin America Needs Access to Resources Without Generating Debt, a new issuance of SDRs. And she has been continuously engaged in advocacy on SDRs ever since. So Patricia is going to now give us a perspective from Latin America on SDRs. Thank you, Patricia.
Thank you, Alex, and hello, everyone. I'm glad to be here. I have some charts in a PPT, so I would ask the IMF team if you could put them on the screen, please.
I don't need to do it at the computer.
Thank you, Andrea. There we go.
Oh, there we go.
Yeah.
So now the click over.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Well, you will. Yes, well, you will see here, you've seen this chart before, it's the allocation. Just to reflect how unequal it was the allocation, it has been mentioned already, advanced economies receive more than 60% of the allocation. And in the case of Latin America, we received almost 8% of the total allocation. But what I want to reflect also here is a calculation, and this will be published very soon in a report that Latin has been working with Andres Arauz, and will be co-published with CIPER as well. So we will keep you posted about this report. And we have here calculations of the allocation per capita. So you can see in blue that, of course, the most developed countries are the ones that received the higher allocation, and in blue, and you can see in different tones of green, especially in the south, which is Africa and Latin America and Asia, the regions that receive a less allocation. But we also do have the use by region, and we have a calculation per capita as well. And these figures are a little bit more updated until February 2023. And you can see here that in the blue tones, you can see how was the use in the south, mainly Africa, but also Latin America. So we can have some sense of the impact because we are looking at per capita calculations. And you can see here as well what was the use of as well. This data has been collected until February 2023, and there have different uses. I will mention them a little bit later, but we can see here that we can see that Africa, in the first column, we can see how many countries used. And we can see that more than 90% of African countries used SDRs. And in the case of Latin America, almost 60% of countries used SDRs. In the second column, we can see the use of SDRs, which has been to pay debts as debts to the IMF, but also in the use for foreign exchange currency. And in the third column, we can see the use for fiscal support. And here, as a fiscal purpose, and we can see here that Africa used, of all the SDRs that they used, 80% of them were aimed for fiscal purposes. And in the case of Latin America, it was more than 40%. So I just wanted to have this visual sense of the use of overall of 190 countries that received SDRs, 94 used them in 2021. The first one, as we saw, Africa, and the second region that used it was Latin America and the Caribbean. And the use was not only to strengthen international reserves, but also there were other uses of SDRs as a balance of payment needs, paying debts, as I said, and for fiscal purposes. In the case of Latin America, we received 51.5 billion. Not all countries received them, but I want to emphasize on the importance for middle-income countries. And we heard today that how low-income countries were benefited, but also middle-income countries did benefit. And actually, this was the main global economic policy for middle-income countries in the context of crisis after the pandemic. Middle-income countries didn't have access to the DSSI or to common framework. So this has been an important initiative for our countries, and in particular in Latin America, where almost all our countries are now classified as middle income. So overall, in my region, 20 countries out of 32 used SDRs. This represents the 55% of SDRs allocated in the region, and it represents 22% of the SDRs allocation that were globally used. The use in my region was creative, and despite what was exactly the final use or destiny of SDRs, it contributed to reduce, for instance, austerity, because countries, instead of using its tax collections and tax revenues to pay debt or to tackle urgent needs that they had in their budgets, they could use SDRs. We have done a research in 3 countries in Latin America, Argentina, Ecuador, and Paraguay. We have done this jointly with Oxfam Latin America, and to see what was exactly the use. And we had to make a local research, because it's not easy to have access to this kind of information. So in Argentina, SDRs were mainly used to pay debt, but they also had, in terms of the financial accountability, a creative use that also had an impact on fiscal ratios, in balance of payments, but also in paying off the debt to the IMF. In the case of Ecuador, it was mainly used to pay debt. And in some cases, we could see that some of them could have been used for budget purposes, but it was not easy really to track this small part. And in the case of Paraguay, it was fully used for budget support. And the main destiny that this had was to for health investment and social protection. SDRs are then important. It's far beyond to say that it's only an asset and to strengthen international reserves. But as I mentioned, it's not easy to track the use due to the financial accounting, and this I will come back to this later in our recommendations, and we'll also let you know some of our recommendations around it for countries, but also for the IMF. I also want to briefly address the rechanneling issue, and from the SDRs that were allocated in developed countries, we have these calculations that will be published in this report, that if rich countries would donate only 25% of the SDRs that they receive, and that of course they are not using, it could be possible to pay and cancel the whole debt that countries have with the IMF, for instance. And this, of course, in addition, would imply for not having programs with the IMF and not having the consolidation measures and the austerity measures. And if this would be done, the impact on rich countries' balance sheets of their central banks would be really minimum, of only 1%. We don't have the calculation, but this can be also an exercise to do with the World Bank and how much of SDRs this would imply. So rechanneling is on the table, has been mentioned in this panel already. The RST has been mentioned as well, and also MDB's role. And I would like to mention here that MDBs at regional levels could have an important role in rechanneling, but it's important to take into account that from the perspective of our countries, any rechanneling that implies debt, it means that we have another business as usual credit, another business as usual loan that implies to have a debt service payment. And in some cases, if it is through the RST with the IMF, it also involves the fiscal consolidation measures that we know. So in the case of the regional MDBs in Latin America, we have 3 now prescribed holders that are that would be able to rechannel. As our countries are classified as middle-income countries, and this is a different discussion if it's okay to classify with a GDP per capita, which is something that we also criticize. But the access to this to credit through regional MDBs in Latin America the concessionality has been changed in particular in the last decade. So it's not really concessional. So this should be an important thing to address if regional development banks will rechannel SDRs. So limitations to rechannel SDRs as grants and as currently is happening only as debt, for us it's also a matter of political will. We can say, well, because the balance sheets of the central banks in developed countries don't allow, but it could allow. And in the report that we will publish, we are going to analyze how this could be registered in central banks for developed countries and how this could be really a game changer in terms of, okay, if it can be done, then is it at the end really a political will for not rechanneling as grants and not only as debts? Finally, among some of additional messages is that the impacts of the SDRs, we have seen some examples that I mentioned today, but the impacts would have been higher if the allocation would have been higher, more ambitious. Rechanneling is important, but the impacts are reduced if they are rechanneled as new debt, as new loan in a context where debt is rising. Providing liquidity is important for reserves, but also the fiscal use. And I mentioned these 3 examples where a fiscal use was really important for these countries. And it's currently is the main, has been the main access to concessional financing for our countries, the countries in our region. And this, of course, could be in the middle term and even in the long term, an important source of financing for the Agenda 2030 and the climate commitments. Latin America, 80% of the financing of the external financing that Latin America uses to fight climate change is with credits, and most of them are not concessional. Lastly, the transparency is important to have registers and the financial accountability as to see how SDRs have been used. And this is a responsibility for the recipient countries, but also for the IMF. And in the case of recipient countries, I want to raise the experience of Paraguay. Paraguay, in the bylaw to use SDRs, included an article, an item to identify the source of financing in their budget. So it's easy to see in the budget the use of the SDR allocation in each item of the budget. So this could be this is a good experience, and this could be a lesson learned for other countries for hopefully future allocations. But, and this could be also something that the IMF could recommend to countries to include the source of finance in the budgets. And that is also important for not only academia or civil society organizations, all stakeholders at national levels could see how SDRs have been used in their countries. But on the other hand, our recommendation also for the IMF is, as responsible of the issuance, is to publish allocation transactions of each country for domestic use at national levels regarding the fiscal use. And why? Because there is information, but there are also IMF credits that are disbursed with as SDRs because it is used by the IMF. So sometimes it's when we see the information, it's hard to see if this is because of the use of certain amount of SDRs denominated in SDRs is because of the credit or it's coming from the allocation. So it would be also important to have a more disaggregated information from the IMF. I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patricia. A lot of food for thought there. Last but not least, we have Richard, who's been paying a great deal of attention to SDRs, I'm sure, from his vantage point at UNCTAD. UNCTAD's last extremely informative and valuable trade and development report discusses how SDRs benefited countries during the pandemic and calls for a fair and more permanent use of special drawing rights to ease balance of payments constraints and reduce fiscal pressures. So I'm wondering, Richard, whether you can sort of expand on that.
Thanks, Alex. I'm not sure. I mean, my fellow panelists have covered the ground pretty thoroughly, and I don't want to take a lot of your time. But let me just give a couple of reflections from the UNCTAD perspective. Some positive, some not so positive. And positively, I mean, UNCTAD, as you hinted, Alex, was very quick to, during the pandemic, come out in support of a large new allocation, SDR allocation. And I think it's important to re-emphasize what my fellow panelists have said. It was a very important step forward and a very large one. It doubled the size of the existing stock of special drawing rights. And despite the limitations that we know about, it was a major source of support for many developing countries, including some of the most vulnerable developing countries. I hope Andrea is right that it's also triggering a rethinking of conditionality if they are rechanneled. I'm a little skeptical of that, I have to say, but I mean it is part of a rethinking of some of the elements of the international architecture that have come out of the pandemic. That triggers a little bit of a worry for us. That is, there's a certain sense, and reinforced by what I've heard this week at these meetings, that advanced economies felt that they had to do something significant, given that they would, in response to the pandemic, given that they were doing something significant for their own people in terms of dealing with the economic consequences of the pandemic. And there's a worry that now the feeling that things are getting back to normal, the pressure on them to actually continue reform will dissipate fairly quickly. And that's a worry. That's a first worry that we have, despite what I think everyone has clearly indicated the value of SDRs are to developing countries. A second issue I think we need to recognize is SDRs were created in a very different time from the way in which the world economy works today. I mean, the world economy is much more financialized, and the potential vulnerabilities that come with highly financialized economies are much greater. To put that in a context, last year, in 2022, that is the year, essentially the year following the allocation of September of 21, developing countries, the reserves of developing countries declined by $360 billion. And the allocation of SDRs was something like $230 billion. So the actual allocation itself came nowhere close to covering the rapid reduction of developing country reserves as a consequence of vulnerabilities to highly speculative short-term exit-prone capital flows, compounded in many cases by the impacts that have on developing country currencies that can trigger the kind of vicious circles that developing countries are particularly worried about at the moment. And I think that kind of underscores Laura's point that SDRs are important, but they're not a panacea to dealing with the kinds of vulnerabilities that developing countries currently face, and then any discussion of SDRs needs to be nestled in a wider discussion of the systemic weaknesses and asymmetries that characterize the current workings of the international financial system. So I think that the changes are very important. Now, that kind of takes me back, not in person, I have to say, in case you try and work out my age, but it takes me back to UNCTAD's early involvement with the special drawing rights discussion, because UNCTAD was essentially there from the beginning. SDRs were initially seen as an instrument solely for advanced economies, the group of 10 that kind of were thinking about the original, the use of SDRs in the early 60s. With advanced economies. It was essentially UNCTAD from 1965, which was the first time UNCTAD got involved in the SDR discussion, was able, I think, to ensure that at least it would be a tool that would be providing a source of liquidity for developing countries as well as advanced economies. It was a classic UNCTAD argument. You know, UNCTAD understood that and was created to understand that as developing countries seek to grow, and the growth target back in the first UN development decade was 5 to 6%. And if countries were to hit that target, they would very quickly run into a balance of payments constraint. And that could very quickly thwart any sort of prospects of a long sustained growth process, which they needed as part of meeting development goals as defined back in the 1960s. So UNCTAD, I think, was very successful in ensuring the wider coverage of SDRs. We were very unsuccessful because we argued it strongly at that time, as we're still doing 60 years later, that you need to decouple SDRs from the quota system if you're going to have a very effective tool that could reflect the needs of countries rather than the political dimension that characterizes the kind of board allocation that marks SDRs to this day. So that whole question of 65, how do you get a fairer allocation of SDRs, was first raised back in 1965. The other issue, of course, that was raised fairly quickly by UNCTAD to be not simply a tool of international liquidity provision, but also a tool of longer-term finance. It was called, back in the day, it was called the link. That is, how do you link SDRs to long-term development finance? And all the issues that we're talking about whether you can, whether you need to change the rules of the articles of the IMF to be able to repurpose SDRs, whether you can find indirect or what we now call rechanneling mechanisms to use SDRs through multilateral development banks or other mechanisms. Back then, the only mechanism that was really discussed was the IDA, which was a potential source of recycling special drawing rights back in the late 1960s, early 1970s. And all the discussions that we're having again 60 years later, 50 years later, were under discussion in the day. So the fact that we have not really moved on these issues in 5 decades is a particularly troubling one from the point of view of UNCTAD, that has been trying to make the case for a different way for the use of SDRs, both as a liquidity tool and a longer-term development financing tool. It's something I think we need to think hard about in terms of what the politics behind special drawing rights are and the kind of alliances that need to be built to ensure that they can, and UNCTAD has always strongly believed, that they can be a much more powerful tool, a financing tool for developing countries than they've tended to be over much of their history. So I think we welcome the suggestions and the proposals that have been made, but we do see not just technical issues that have to be overcome, but there are technical issues, but also fairly deep-rooted political issues that need to be discussed in a fairly open and frank manner if they're going to serve the purpose that I think they should be serving. So let me leave it there.
Thank you, Richard. And I have a lot of questions, but I'm also aware that there isn't much time left. So I'm not going to abuse too much of my prerogative as moderator to ask a couple of quick questions, and then we'll take some questions from the audience. Perhaps we'll have time to take questions as well from online, if that's possible. We're still investigating that. But please, if you're online and can send us something via the chat, please feel free to do so. We'll see if it works. And so my quick questions then that can be taken by any of the panelists is that, first of all, there seems to be a lot of talk within the IMF about rechanneling SDRs. And Andrea gave us a great overview of the different forms of rechanneling that are under discussion. And of course, 2 are already active. We're still waiting to see whether there will be rechanneling to MDBs. But as I think a few of us have underlined, there's also a growing clamor for a new SDR allocation, certainly outside of the IMF. And, my question is there anything inherently contradictory in pursuing rechanneling schemes while also seeking a new allocation of SDRs? And then secondly, both Richard and Jason kind of underlined a limitation of the SDR allocations as we've seen them so far. Richard pointed to the fact that, with this last allocation, the reserve needs of countries are not being met, not even close. By an allocation like this one. Jason pointed out that an allocation here and there tends to keep countries, certainly on the African continent, in a constant sort of short-term planning mode, doesn't create space for more long-term planning, economic planning. And I just wanted to remind everyone that, you've had for a long time a proposal for regular issuances of SDRs. The Nobel laureate Joseph Stiglitz, former US Treasury official and Fed official, Ted Truman, who a number of us know, who's been very engaged on this issue, has also called for regular issuances of SDRs in a paper that he sort of published, a draft paper that was online. He had a scheme for annual issuances of SDRs. Famously, Prime Minister Mia Mottley of Barbados at COP26 in Glasgow was also suggesting yearly issuances of SDRs. And so I'm just wondering if any of the panelists thinks it could be possible and if it would make sense for SDR allocations to become a sort of a regular thing and a permanent policy of the IMF. So those are my questions, but I'd like to also take first round of questions from the audience. Anybody out there? Yes, Rick.
Hi, I'd just like to ask any of the panelists, can you describe how you would view the difference between the U.S. Federal Reserve engaging in quantitative easing and the way with which it sort of creates money out of thin air to purchase bonds as part of the quantitative easing process? And how would you see that as different or similar to the way the IMF can create new SDRs? Thank you.
Yes, go ahead.
Hi, Kate Globally-Swan from UNCTAD. My question is for Andrea, but maybe also other panelists if you want to give any reflections. At COP26, we heard, I suppose, a kind of request from the Green Climate Fund to become a prescribed holder, and there have been suggestions of other institutions becoming prescribed holders. We also know at COP27 there was
the decision to establish a new fund this year, the loss and damage fund. Is there any discussion internally about new prescribed holders? And then obviously in that outcome, there was a specific request to the IFIs to consider their role in financing loss and damage, and just to see if SDRs is being considered along those lines. Thank you.
Okay, and one more. Yes, in the back, thanks.
I'm Mona Ali from State University of New York. I had a question for you, Mr. Gamba, about this idea that France seems to have embraced yesterday about the SDR bond. And in my view, it was sort of connected to the Paris summit. So I'm wondering if that's going to be rechanneling European and US SDRs. It's about 300 billion to that new loss and damage facility. And I'm just wondering what the IMF really has been thinking about the SDR bond.
Thanks. We'll try to do a second round of questions, but I think we'll start there. There's already a number. So we'll start with Andrea.
Thank you very much for the questions, and I think let me start maybe with the SDR bond one, and of course the caveat there is that this is also kind of rather new, so we do not have much kind of technical work behind it. What I read was an earlier proposal. I think it was published in the Financial Times about SDR bonds. I think the recurring theme for us is that we, as an institution, are very open to explore with everybody how best to make use with SDRs and bonds, hybrid capital for MDBs. They are all ideas worth exploring, and we are very happy also to kind of support technically this kind of proposal to see whether they are feasible or not from the technical level. Eventually, many of these things are political, as was mentioned before, and so it boils down to be a shareholder decision, and that's something that we would need to kind of basically sit back and basically respect what our shareholders prescribe us to look into more deeply. This question was also related to the loss and damage, and the previous question of the Global Climate Fund as prescribed holder. So on loss and damage, I don't think the fund is directly involved. And I'll come back to that because I think that this and also the previous question and others, other comments are related to one thing in general that I want to say about the way the SDR versus the broader toolbox that we all need to collectively push to get to the goal. And the question there is, there are things that the SDR can be pushed to do better. There are other things that the SDR is gonna unlikely to be able to deliver quickly from a purely technical standpoint. And this is really beyond any kind of political or kind of even moral consideration. We need to play with the cards we have, and the SDRs are right now difficult to be conceived as a grant, for example, because they're part of reserves. And so it's not really a matter of IMF articles of agreement, but rather the national legislation that if it is a reserve asset, that's why it's so complicated to channel them and to use them. So it's if there are ideas how to make the grants, it's again we would be open, but really this is more a matter of trying to get an agreement with at the national level of what constitute reserves and whatnot. And it's so it's a bit beyond the technical role that the SDR as conceived right now can do. And of the prescribed holders, we have new prescribed holders. I think as of in the last 3 months, we had several new MDBs which are now prescribed holders. We are in talks with others who are likely gonna submit an application to become prescribed holders, and we're gonna assess them. So this is an ongoing process. There's no deadline in a way, and so as we receive the application, we consider them and we talk to the institution at a technical level, and so we'll be able in a position to assess them in the coming month. I would say, if you allow me one more minute on the general point I was making on the toolkit, and because I think that really the trick would be to try and use all tools together. The point I want to make is that we need SDRs, and we have done this allocation. We've seen that basically 60% of low-income countries used it, so it's been useful. We know it's useful. We know it cannot be a repeated game, frequent game in the current institutional context. But we also need grants, and that's something that, again, it's for mostly, the international community to try and step them up. And we need concessional finance, which is debt, as you correctly mentioned. Like SDR channeling is typically debt, because at some point, even very long term, but it will need to be repaid. But it is concessional. So the point is that, especially with the RST and with the zero rate with the RGT, we have made this concession. So in a way, also the fund is trying to go in the direction of increased concessionality, increased space, not only with, in a way, the quantities and the debt levels, but really also the conditionality. If you look at our staff reports today compared to our staff reports in the early 2000, I think you wouldn't think it's the same institution, probably, right? In terms of the attention that we put on, fiscal space, the need to do investments for growth, for development. And all these, in a way, we need to kind of lift further, but without forgetting that, there are the reciprocal limits that each institution needs to go. And in a way, it's going to be a package. And every single tool will not make it to get the very significant amount of money which is needed to achieve SDGs. Thank you.
Thanks, Jason.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, maybe on the idea of rechanneling, new allocation, and regular issuance, I think, as I stated before, I think there is a place in the short term, but my concern really is if we continue with this narrative without thinking through a more deeper and systemic change of the architecture that African countries are operating in, then what we're doing is just keeping the same cycle moving on. The trade system, the global financial system, is it changing apace with the role of the African continent as the African continent evolves? Would regular issuances or a new allocation necessarily transform the African continent in the current financial and economic architecture? I think, largely speaking, the answer is no, right? Because we're still a primary exporting continent. We still have, we're still or currently implementing a very deep debt financing development agenda rather than a domestic resource mobilizing financing agenda. We have a model, an economic system that is extractive from the continent. So would a new allocation in the medium to the long term or consistent allocation, regular issuances help us move the needle of the continent to where we don't rely on or need this? I think, broadly speaking, the answer is no. But in terms of crisis, is there a role for special drawing rights on the continent? I think the evidence indicates that there is. But I mean, we do need to move the conversation away from the short term, the elastoplast approach to Africa's transformation. I think the continent's role in global economy and global finance has changed dramatically over several decades, and therefore the architecture within which it is interacting needs to also reflect those changes. So I do think that important, but it is not the silver bullet, and I think we need to really be very deliberate in articulating that. I think on the broader conversation around climate and the loss and damage, this and so on, again, let's also see this as an opportunity where there is a convergence on issues of finance. I think, Richard, you put it very well somewhere. I read that issues of climate are not humanitarian; they are development issues, and therefore they should not be isolated from the broader development finance conversation. So there is an emergency, yes, but there are also fundamental development finance issues that need to be resolved. What kind of trade-offs are being made if all of a sudden we're going to say, well, we need SDRs for climate? What are the kind of trade-offs that are being calculated for countries in the African continent? And the reason I'm saying this is because we need to then fully understand what the entire development finance landscape needs to be. And I think the issues around climate should be seen alongside issues of tax, addressing issues of debt, as well as addressing things like illicit financial flows. And this is particularly for the African continent, because there's still a lot of extraction that is taking place. And these kind of conversations, if we start spreading them out, it does become very disparate and incoherent in terms of what's happening within the global financial and economic architecture.
Thank you, Jason. And for our remaining panelists, I'll just ask you to keep it quite short since we don't have much time yet, but I'll also ask for the indulgence of the IMF to allow us to go over by a few minutes so that we can answer these questions and perhaps even take some more. Patricia, please, thanks.
Thanks. Well, you asked if there is a contradiction, and I think that the rechanneling is the way to correct the failure of the wrong distribution in the allocation in the first place, and trying to make a progressive something that was born as a regressive initiative. So, but in a slow, short manner and in the form of debt. So if it makes sense to have another allocation or regular allocations, and I agree with Jason, in a context of crisis, besides it's one crisis after the other, it's not that we are still in the pandemic, it's one crisis after the other. So in a context of crisis, yes, it is makes sense. While in the middle and long term, for instance, the global tax system is changes, and our countries can fairly collect their taxes in a more sustainable way. But while other systemic changes take place, yes, in the current context and in the short term, new and regular allocations are important, because the recovery remains unequal, and we have seen the figures. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Richard?
Yeah, I think the Malcolm X principle of by any means necessary, given the scale of the problems that we face, is probably the right one to adhere to. And so if we can rechannel as well as ensure regular issuances, I don't see these as being in any sense inconsistent with each other. I mean, they require institutional reforms, and we need to recognize that. I think one of the issues that would come up quickly, because it came up in the 60s, was whether they were inflationary on a global level, if you were going to issue them on the kind of scale that we're talking about. And I think that might be an issue that would have to be addressed again. But I think we need, and for us at least, if they can fuel an increase in long-term concessionary lending, if they can be the basis for scaling up concessionary financing, or there is debt creating, then I think that's something that we, when you're talking about $2 trillion a year in financing a climate transition in developing countries, then concessionary lending will be a significant part of that story. And if SDRs can unlock that, then I think we have to welcome it. And Rick, clearly they're not like QE at the moment. You know, Janet Yellen can find $400 billion under her sofa to help save banks. I don't think SDRs, unfortunately, have that degree of flexibility that the Federal Reserve has at the moment right now.
Thanks, Richard. Laura?
And just to pick up on that, I would say that the similarities with that and SDRs is that the US calls the shots in both cases, even though for SDRs, it should be a multilateral decision. And then the difference is the US, as Richard said, tends to be a lot more generous when it comes to its own banks and financial system. And we can extend the point to also swap lines for its friends and not just domestic QE. And just to end maybe on the contradiction point too, of they're not contradictory, but the question here is political will, because rechanneling is being presented as something that like, oh, we still have this 400 billion unused, so then we don't need a new one. They're not contradictory. Otherwise, it just means that it takes away the political will and kind of gives the cover of saying you're doing something. But my point was that what you're doing is actually extremely different because you're taking something that has no conditionality and is debt-free and turning it into something that is more debt.
Thanks, Laura. And do we perhaps have time for a couple of more questions? There was, yes.
Yeah, thanks. I'm John Sword with the Bretton Woods Project, and we may not get to the bottom of this just now, but I was struck in the presentations in terms of the evidence showing, you know, this mismatch. On the one hand, the allocation is properly targeted in the sense to low and middle income countries who use them as a buffer for the COVID-19 crisis. But in another sense, you have this large amount of SDRs sitting on balance sheets of countries who don't really need them. So I just wanted to sort of link this to your question, Alex, about this notion of regular allocations and maybe linking back to Richard's point about UNCTAD's longstanding proposal for SDRs as a source of development financing. I guess in the current context, how would you see that being designed, given this mismatch that we see between a large number of, you know, the largest shareholders don't actually need this source of reserves, yet it's hardwired into IMF quota and the imbalances we see around that. So, yeah, that's what I wanted to ask. Thanks.
Anyone else? Yeah, in the back.
Yeah, thank you. Benjamin Sanchez, the Department of Treasury. On the topic of SDR allocation as potential source of development financing, I want to ask if any of the panelists could, you know, maybe elaborate on the relationship of a more regular SDR allocation in regards to supplementing or potentially replacing the more predatory type of development lending we see from governments like the People's Republic of China, and on the flip side, potentially it's a source of something that's more of a taxpayer-friendly type of development aid from the U.S. bilateral. Thank you.
Okay, one very last one. No, okay. Well, we'll keep it there. So, panelists, there were definitely questions for Richard. Anyone else want to take questions, Laura?
I'm happy to take the question of, you said predatory lending from China, but maybe, you know, develop a little bit what do you mean by that, and how are Chinese loans predatory in a different way than IMF loans, and how is, you know, in the debt situation, China is not the largest creditor. So it kind of seems like a weird comparison to make. And the US is the one that calls the shots at the IMF, and the IMF and World Bank are the institutions known for their conditionality in lending. That's
okay.
I would endorse that. I mean, the discussion on Chinese lending, unfortunately, in the Americas is very, very distorted. I mean, the Sri Lanka being the classic case. I mean, you've got to take a serious look at the Sri Lankan case and an objective look at the Sri Lankan case, because the kind of simplistic classification of Chinese lending as predatory is highly misleading and and unfortunately just sours the discussion about what China does need to do, which is to restructure some of these debts along with private creditors and advanced economy creditors. So it's an unfortunate, I think, use of the language we need to move on from that, really. I don't have an answer to it, unfortunately. I do like the proposal that the African development. That's an interesting proposal. I don't know where it stands. They are an accredited holder, and I think there are real opportunities there using some of the regional development banks to scale up. I think that, and I haven't followed it closely enough to know where their proposal stands more broadly, but whenever I've listened to it, it seems like something that the IMF should take seriously. So I hope you are. I don't know if you are or not, but I hope you are.
Just to say that, confirm that we are, and we did in a way work with the African Development Bank, and we came to the conclusion that the design that we saw it does not raise concern in terms of keeping the SDRs as reserve asset, which is a critical, hurdle that basically any financing tool based on SDR needs to keep, because otherwise you would not have willingness by many shareholders to give it, because they are, constrained by their national legislations. But on where it stands in terms of then how it is structured, in terms of then delivering the products to the countries, in terms of the financial packages, that I wouldn't know, and it's something that surely the AFDB is working on.
Okay, thanks. Anyone else? Okay, great. Well, I'd like to thank the panelists. Let's give them a quick round of applause. Thank you. This was a very rich discussion. I think there was a lot of consensus on the panel and with the audience on the usefulness of SDRs. I think near consensus on the importance of more allocations of SDRs, although Andrea didn't take a strong position on that. And a few disagreements here and there on China and so on, but we are in Washington, D.C., and that was to be expected. And so I'd like to thank you all for being here. The whole video will be up online, I believe, so you can go back if you want to watch this again. And at CEPR, we might try to do a transcript and put that up on our website. So look out for that as well at cepr.net. Thanks very much, everyone.